Hey everybody, this is Tom Vander Ark from Getting Smart. We're here to talk about making the best of a pretty terrible situation that we're in. We come together today in the middle of a series of crises: a health crisis, an economic crisis, a climate crisis, a race crisis. And I don't want for a minute to belittle the tough situation that tens of millions of Americans are in. So we do enter this space with humility and thought about all of those that are suffering for a number of reasons. But we do want, with a group of 5 friends and colleagues, to talk about what good could come from the suffering and the work that's being done in schools and in communities around the country. I'm joined today by 5 extraordinary leaders: Carlos Moreno from Big Picture, Juan Cabrera from El Paso Unified, Pam Cantor, the founder of Turnaround, Sujata Bhatt from Transcend, and Courtney Collins Shapiro, the CEO of Portal Schools. I've asked each of them to spend a few minutes talking about the good that could emerge from this situation. Carlos, would you kick us off and give us your take?
Yeah, happy to, Tom, and thank you for that opening and just recognizing just the reality that a lot of folks are experiencing in this moment. I mean, we haven't seen this level of combined crisis in the country since the 1940s. And in fact, there was a Washington Post article today that many of us, I think, probably have seen, that shared that the COVID-19 recession is the most unequal in modern US history. And I'll also share, honestly, I initially had some serious mixed feelings about it. I think it's appropriate that this session is titled as it is. The phrase "never let a crisis go to waste," of course, was famously stated by Winston Churchill during the formation of the United Nations following the end of the Second World War. And it was a call not only to action, but to unity. And it is what I really believe that is what is needed right now. I draw focus to the formation of the United Nations because in many ways, I think that's the level of commitment and coordination it's going to take. Because we can look at this moment as an example, or that moment as an example of good that can emerge from a crisis. But the issue that I think we face when people look back at history is a feeling that quote unquote good immediately follows quote unquote bad. The truth is, good takes time, good takes effort. There was a period of refreshed economic activity brought on by a feeling of national unity that followed the Second World War, just as there was following the post-flu pandemic in 1918. But it took several years for that to happen and for it to generate. So we can already anticipate what we know, and what physicians and folks a lot smarter than I am have already stated, that the distribution of COVID vaccines are going to take some time. We already know that people who have had COVID are continuing experiencing lingering effects, and our health and education system will have to really adapt to that. All of this to say that if we know that it's going to take us some time to quote unquote get to good, what's the point in waiting around to get started? So first, let's start by abandoning any idea of getting back to normal. I'll echo the sentiments of brother Ricardo Pitts Wiley, who recently said, "I don't want to go back to normal, I want to go forward to better." A path back to normal for too many of our young people means an over-reliance on standardized testing, sage on the stage learning practices, bell schedules, children having to wake up before the sun to catch a bus to school. And worse than that, back to normal would mean inequitable distribution of public funds to public education, disproportionate delivery of methods of discipline like detention and expulsion. Could go on. And in too many communities, back to normal just means school shooting drills, metal detectors, and law enforcement officers roaming the halls. Again, the good that can come out of this is that we have an opportunity to really plan and prepare and strategically insert ourselves into conversations so that we can shape the new realities with young people at home. It's very clear that every child's learning needs to be highly personalized and individualized. The pandemic and physical distancing has made it all the more painfully clear that there is tremendous value and power in relationships. There goes a big picture person talking about relationships again. Yesterday, in a session of student learners and leaders, Sophia Irvin, one of our students from our school in San Diego, shared that distance learning has forced her to bond and build true relationships and friendships with students from her school that she may not have otherwise. For better or for worse, there is a real get to know each other aspect that occurs when you find yourself in a Zoom breakout room with someone you've never interacted with before. Half the folks on this call I've never met before, but have heard of and have followed and have been fond of their work. All learners, and particularly young learners, benefit from the relationships they forge with their parents and family members and adult mentors they connect with beyond the walls of the school in situated learning environments. So I believe that in the days following this pandemic, systems will have a real opportunity to create learning plans with students that attend to and intentionally nurture and value these relationships as critical to their learning process. Thanks for having me, Tom.
Thank you, Carlos. Check out bigpicture.org for more information about the big picture learning model. Carlos, like you, I hope we will see more interest in the sort of model that your organization's been advancing for 20 years. Dr. Pamela Cantor, the founder of Turnaround, and I think will echo many of the whole child learning and equity comments that you made, Carlos. Dr. Cantor, what do you hope comes from this?
Well, I want to pick up on one very big thing that Carlos said, and that was going forward, not going back. There is a convergence of forces right now where adversity, inequity, and racism can become the defining context in which millions of young people grow up, most importantly, kids of color. I don't know whether you saw another stat in the New York Times today where 4,200 kids in New York have experienced the loss of one parent. The loss of a parent is a catastrophe in a child's life. 325,000 children in New York pushed into poverty. In the short term, we are facing the fact that the education that young people received in low-income communities have not prepared them for 21st century skills, mastery level competencies, and most importantly, opportunity. On the other hand, kids from middle class and affluent communities largely have these skills and are either prepared or are being supported to navigate this period. And when you think about which tools in our adaptive toolkit any of us is going to use to navigate this massive change, we realize it's our resilience, it's our agency, it's our problem-solving skills and collaboration skills, and our creativity. So the gap in opportunity we all knew was there is now going to widen dramatically unless we go forward. But I believe we can use this crisis to reimagine and transform our education system so that schools are places that are designed with the knowledge we have today. And we have the knowledge to do this today using the principles of whole child design. One of the things that I want us to do for a second is to imagine something. Imagine a world where every child's life was actually a succession of opportunities in which they came to know who they are, in which they discover who they could become. Imagine learning settings of all kinds that were designed with those kinds of opportunities that are possible, that can be optimized, no matter where the child started their educational journey. Imagine, too, that educators could find how best to identify each child's specific abilities, interests, their aspirations, and then align these attributes with aspects of the context in schools that promotes their talents, their achievements, and enables their success. And finally, imagine that each child lived in a world that removed many of the constraints of racism, poverty, disparities, particularly economic disparities and injustices, and provided them exactly what they needed in specific relationships that support their thriving. That's what I think this disruption could produce.
Thank you, Dr. Cantor. I appreciate that. I'm heartened by the number of schools that are paying more attention to social emotional learning, that are really trying to reconnect with learners. And your organization recently put out a really important set of guidance around tiered support that I think is so important to quickly assessing the needs that kids have and then making sure that they're getting the support they need. If you look at turnaround.org, you can see those important resources. Juan Cabrera is the, Juan, is this your 8th year in El Paso?
I'm in my 8th year, yes.
And Juan, I know this is like walking into the emergency room where you're undergoing emergency surgery and saying, what good is going to come from this? Because I know you are in full battle mode. It's unbelievably complicated running a big district. Your team, I've watched them over the summer just doing heroic effort to get ready for a crazy, unbelievable, unpredictable fall. But is there any way that you can look past the crisis that you're in the middle of to see any good that could come from this?
Yeah, actually, I think it's probably similar in a lot of respects to what Pamela and Carlos shared. I love that Carlos spoke a lot about equity, and I love the whole child approach that Pamela described. But I think for me, it's actually a manifestation and a realization, if I try to really look at the silver lining of how we started the work in 2013, when I took over a really broken school system, that the superintendent had been arrested and gone to jail. The board had been removed by the state. So it was real trauma and crisis in 2013 when I took over the system. And I visited with Tom not too soon, in fact, that's when I was introduced to Tom, not too long after I took the helm of the district. And there were a lot of approaches you could have taken at that time. And I took a really unique approach, and that was one to focus on the whole child. And our approach was, rather than just taking, over the school system and really focusing on data and I mean, specifically test prep, if you will, and focusing just on the numbers of the academics, what if we did something different? What if the superintendent didn't speak about accountability and test prep and started speaking more about relationships and building relationships with students? The genesis of that, in terms of my mind, the way I thought about that was that this school district had gotten to where they had gotten because it was a hyper focus on accountability, therefore getting kids ready for the test. And if you look at the inverse relationship in my mind of that, the more you focus only on the test, the less you focus on the relationship with a child. So I wanted to remove that from the equation. And for us, I spent the first 4 years, I don't know if another superintendent would have done this in the first 4 years, and it was risky. I didn't talk about accountability or data. When I met with the principals and I met with folks, I talked about relationships, building relationships with kids, creating active learning and engaging environments. So I say all that to answer your question in this way, Tom. For me, the first thing we did, we met, and I'll remember, I hate to say that our country's based on this, but I'm not going to comment on politics. The real, the big switch for me was when the NBA canceled their season on Wednesday, March 11th. And I was in Austin, Texas to be at South by Southwest, and I was actually speaking at an event. And that event had been canceled, but I already had my tickets, so I went ahead and went to Austin to meet with the Texas Education Agency. And I was at dinner and everything, NBA canceled their season. That next day, I called my team. We have about 9,000 folks. I have about 30 people on my leadership team, about 8 people in my cabinet. And I said, from today forward, we're no longer an academic institution. We're half academics and half social work. And the other half of this work is going to be undefined, but it's whatever a family needs to get through this crisis. That includes home visits. That includes collaborating with each and every nonprofit that we can bring to our disposal. That means us giving money to local charities that'll help boost the efforts in the areas that we can't. Forget about the limits that we placed on ourselves as a school system. We're going to do whatever it takes to connect with and identify any family in crisis or any family that can't get their hands on the technology or food or housing or health, anything at all that they might need. And so to me, if I'm going to, again, look at this as a silver lining in the midst of a horrible crisis, it's almost like taking the ideas of 2013 and 2014, Tom, and taking it to another level, because we have a little, once they told us we're going to have accountability in the spring of 2019, then I realized we could really do what I've always wanted to do, which is just focus on relationships. Obviously still care a lot about virtual schooling and what we had to do in the entire spring, but we created an entire team called EPISD Student Cares Team to do nothing but focus on relationships with these families. And we even instituted, and this upset a lot of people, I had every teacher call every child to say, just check on them and ask them, are you okay? And some families were mad at us because we're asking them, were they okay? Did they need anything? But for the handful of people that were upset about that, I didn't mind. I know that that was the right thing to do and to check on our families in that way. So for us, I'm hoping that on the other side of this, not only are we much more technologically savvy and have taken the work to a different level on the technology side, and really, I think, have a real chance to have flipped classrooms and hybrid learning like we dreamed about this 20 years ago. Now it's going to become a reality. And the second thing is, I think it's a manifestation and a realization of the work I wanted to do, which is relationships, love, and caring for kids supersedes academics. And if you do that right, the academics will come. And I'm proud to say that the last couple of years, we're the highest rated, largest urban district in Texas. And I guarantee you, we're the only one that doesn't focus on test prep.
Thank you, Juan. It's a great story. I spent July interviewing your whole leadership team, and it was really gratifying to hear their stories and the fact that they were proud of the work that they had done over the last 5 years and felt that it really had prepared them to shift to virtual, that they'd become a real agile
Yes.
culture focused on whole child. And so when I think about what good could come from this, is that I think districts around the country can learn from your whole child focus, from a can-do, whatever it takes for kids and community culture. So thanks for your work. We really
Tom,
appreciate
can I
it.
just add something? The reality is, and we know this if we've worked in urban systems, we've always should have focused on the hierarchy of needs. But we got so carried away with accountability that we forgot about checking on kids and see how they're doing.
Right.
I'm hoping that's what really sustains itself on the other side.
Sujata Bhatt, and I guess we spent time together in Boston when you were deputy there. I really appreciated the agenda that she and Tommy put together in Boston. She's a principal at Transcend these days. I'll put your link in the chat as well. Transcend has really produced a lot of terrific resources during the pandemic. Sujata, thanks for your work, and what's your hope that we could bring from this crisis?
I think I want to thank you, Tom, and I want to echo what everyone has said. I think that Juan just gave us a great example of the silver lining of this crisis, which was essentially the largest education experiment in the history of humanity, and it was a global experiment that we were forced to undergo. And what it did was unleash an incredible amount of innovation. What had been potential innovation energy in the system actually became kinetic active energy. So how might we continue to tap that so that we can move from responding to crisis after crisis towards a real whole, not just whole child, but also whole adult recovery, because everyone in the system has been experiencing trauma, from children, their families, teachers, parents, school leaders, system leaders. Every superintendent I talk to says one word over and over again: exhausted. I'm exhausted. It's exhaustion. I think this whole recovery is a crucial part of the road forward, and the road forward then needs to go towards reinvention. What we saw in these last few months is that the industrial model of schooling that we've been under for so long doesn't work. It didn't work before, but now we see how deeply it doesn't work and how inequitably it doesn't work. And then there is a huge flourishing of innovation all across the system and inside the systems and outside the systems: learning pods, learning coalitions, out of school learning, homeschool becomes a different kind of viable option. We have districts that are experimenting with learning pods, all these kinds of ways where students are no longer locked into seat time and same batch model of learning. How do we activate that and really move us towards a reinvented education system that centers on the needs of learners? And we're seeing so many great signs of superintendents in particular and school leaders and design teams at schools that bring student voice into their process. Because when you have students telling you how it's working for them and not working for them, and when you bring them to the table as co-designers with you, you cannot go back to the old ways of doing things because it didn't work for so many people. I think the danger we fall into, though, is that all of this innovation energy gets used and everyone is reinventing the wheel. So how might we speed people along in their process? How might we give them the resources, the tools, the methods they need in order to get to more extraordinary, equitable school designs faster and with a broader reach? There are 132,000 school communities out there. Every single one of them needs redesigning. Let's get us there with maximum support so that schools can do what they need to do, which is meet all levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, including innovating with teaching and learning.
Carlos, does small community-connected school format sound familiar to you?
A little bit, a little bit.
Your organization's been advancing that model for 20 years.
Yeah, yes, we have, and it's been nice to see our small band of schools and school leaders also just serve as partners for their larger systems, especially around matters of engagement. So yes.
Courtney, we've been having some interesting conversations this fall about innovative school models. You're the CEO of Portal Schools. What good do you see that could come from this?
Yeah, it's tough to go last after this sort of illustrious group here on the first part of the panel, but I will give it a shot. So I think when I contemplate silver lining, and a lot of the things that my peers have said resonate, I think something we've been trying to do in our space is really taking advantage of the crisis to ask why about what we do currently in K-12 or even K-16, and why not about the things that we're not doing. And I'd say rather than just talk about them, like what do we actually do about that? I've been quite shocked, and it's great to have innovators on this call from big systems like WAN, but I actually think from having worked in large urban systems, WAN is not the norm. So innovative big school superintendents, and I think that as you think about the tens of millions of kids who are in schools across the country, the vast majority are still in major school districts, and so we do need innovators to step up inside districts, but we also need to reimagine sort of the delivery systems of education. So we talked about sort of the mediocrity or more than mediocrity of the current systems, that we've built a system over hundreds of years that serves the haves and disenfranchises the have-nots. And so I don't think that we can face this crisis. We can look at learning learning delivery mechanisms. We can look at innovation, but I also actually think we need to get serious as a country about policy and funding. Like, I don't think it can go unsaid. We can innovate all we want around the edges. We can do learning pods. We can have all sorts of different things, but we have to get serious about the national, state level, and local community conversation about. We have built structural inequity in the way in which we fund and deliver education in this country. And if we don't get at that, we can all innovate all we want on the edges, but we aren't going to crack the big system that's serving, again, tens of millions of kids. So for me, there's this sense of like, can we reimagine? And lots of my peers on this call have talked about reimagining the system and not going back. I also find from 30 years working in this space that your typical educator is very resistant to change. And so I do hear a lot, unfortunately, from the rank and file, I just want it to be the way it was. And so what are we going to do at the leadership level to not fall back into old practices and just say, well, I want to get back to that as fast as I can? How do we harness the innovation that's happening right now? And I think, how do we really push this topic of that the majority of learners are in settings that is not leading to them building on their talents or having opportunities in the future? So until this crisis, I think that a lot of people are just too afraid to challenge the status quo. But you layer the crisis of COVID-19 and people finally taking notice at a mass scale about pervasive racial injustice in this country. And every American is asking the question at every socioeconomic level of what is a good and worthwhile education? And quite honestly, where does that even have to take place? So we're in this moment where they're asking that question, and we have the attention of people we didn't have the attention of before. I think about policy coalitions, and we would be fighting frequently in my home state of Pennsylvania for how do we get equitable access to education, particularly for low-income students, people of color, new immigrants. And the challenge is always that the majority voice is never at the table. So to coin a phrase, we now have white soccer moms at the table thinking about what education should look like, and that maybe what was happening in the past wasn't the best thing for their kids. If we can capture some folks who haven't typically been in the conversation, I think we can move a policy practice, sort of the activity around that, a lot faster. Sujata, you mentioned more families are taking advantage of lots of different opportunities. So there's homeschooling, they're creating learning pods, we're creating micro schools. People are shifting attention. Parents are saying, I'm going to spend time on what sparks joy for my child, and I'm maybe not going to be as focused on what you would consider traditional core content areas, because that's what I need right now.
Courtney,
Yeah.
we got an interesting question that said, what are some of the most radical ideas you're envisioning right now? It strikes me that the school model that you're working on is pretty radical in terms of the goal, the setting, and the size. Maybe you could spend a minute describing the Portal school model.
Sure. So I think Portal really does come out of why not. So we took a look in the secondary space of why can't you blur the lines between secondary and post-secondary? A lot of folks are dabbling in dual enrollment, AP, things like that. But what if you really blew it up and said, what are we actually spending our time on in the high school space? And could kids leave you with a high school diploma and a bachelor's degree at the same time, for real? Like, not a couple credits, but what would that actually look like if you design that for kids? And how would you overlay that using a competency-based framework? Second, it was thinking about, like, let's get serious about equity and say, like, what does diverse by design really mean? And how do you make sure, if you're building micro schools of 60 kids, that you really have all walks of life in your community and embrace that? And I think third, it's about career-connected learning. So if we're saying we're going to push young people to figure out their path and delve into their passions over a 4-year blended college and high school experience, I also want them to be thinking about what comes next. And so how do I embed myself in the workplace? So the Portal locations are at employer sites. So kids can be exposed to, what does a workplace look and feel like? If I want to do an apprenticeship with somebody in the technology division or the finance division or human resources, I get to dabble in that. And then, by the way, by the time I'm a senior, if I was dabbling and that was my passion, I spent a very significant amount of time training or getting last mile training in that space. So when I graduate with my high school diploma and my bachelor's, I'm ready to go. Sure, I can go do something else. I can get an advanced degree, but I'm ready. And we've really seen in big picture, I mean, Carlos, this probably resonates, like, Some of this is the micro school space is about relationships. It's small. Kids are building relationships with kids. Adults are building relationships with kids and with each other. We're also bringing in the concept of like letting kids co-design. So while we have a model that says this is very clearly how you're going to do this blending of college and high school, why are we not letting 15-year-olds say, I don't want to take a seminar on Poe. I want to take a seminar on, the civil rights movement during this era, and 6 of us want to do it. So, hey, go for it, design it, and you know what, we'll co-design. Wouldn't their learning be more rich and impactful if they have a voice in doing that? And am I going to check some boxes around like you had to take Algebra 2? Sure, because I want you to be ready. I want you to be proficient in certain areas. But we're really saying you're going to graduate, you're going to be exposed to real world learning. You're going to be learning with your peers that are from all walks of life. And you can actually do this in a lot less time and for a lot less money. In the state of California where we're launching, the average private high school costs, upwards of $40,000 a year, and your, post-secondary degree is going to cost you tens of thousands more. If we can say you can do all of this in 4 years and then go pursue your passion, why not?
Yeah.
But again, Tom, lots of people look at you and say we're nuts, right? It's always, well, how will you do this and how will you do that?
It's a cool model. We featured a 19-year-old fifth-year senior from Da Vinci that completed her BA from SNHU. So we know it's possible. And at Da Vinci, there are 70 students right now taking the SNHU dual enrollment competency-based curriculum. So it's a crazy idea of combining high school and college and doing it in a super supportive environment where there's applied learning going on. But Carlos, you have a number of big picture schools on college campuses where kids are both working and learning, completing high school and college. That's a pretty radical idea.
We do. And even at our founding school, which you know well, Tom, the Met School in Providence, we've had an incredible number of young people who have, for ceremonial purposes, received their AA right before they receive their high school diploma. But it's all about intentionality with that design, right? Like being on a college campus, allowing young people to see what is possible. Not necessarily saying this is the path that you need to take, but knowing that that is an option for you. So yes, it's absolutely intentional for us.
Pam, you're thinking big thoughts. We had a conversation yesterday about the future of measurement, of how we could create an education system that had focused on very different metrics. Is that one of the crazy ideas that you'd like to advance?
Absolutely. So if I were to be just a little bit nerdy for a moment and say that literally at the molecular level of the brain, what is happening for kids when they are in powerful relationships, context designed exactly the way that you all have spoken about, where agency is harnessed, where creativity is harnessed, and where kids are doing things that they believe are important to them. Okay, that's what you've all been talking about. But what you've actually described is the engine that moves electrons in the brain, causing structures in the brain to become wired together. And relationships are the force that brings that about. So all the different ways that you're structuring the learning process that you've talked about today is the ignition switch for the development of creativity, complex skills, 21st century skills. But we don't measure that. We don't build it. And we don't measure the process of developing a learner. And right now, the technology actually exists and the methodologies exist to actually measure individual growth in children and to use these methodologies to be able to see the pathways of the acquisition of higher order skills in kids. We can measure mastery level competencies, but if we don't measure the acquisition of the skills that build a life, then we're missing a giant piece of development. And in not combining them together and combining them with an understanding of this context, this amazing context that you're building. But today the methodology exists to tie all those things together: 21st century skills, the environment, and mastery level competencies. It all exists today. So
Yeah, I think,
yeah.
well, I think Superintendent Cabrera is running a school district with that set of goals in mind. I think, Juan, you wish you had a better measurement system to help kids tell their story and to be able to communicate the growth that you're promoting in your schools. Isn't that fair?
You're on mute, Juan.
On your mute.
Sorry about that. I said absolutely that the board is 100% behind us here. In fact, Tom, you helped us create our student learning goals, none of which include state accountability or any measure, any quantitative measure around testing, and a lot of which include the student learning goals we created. You know, critical thinking, problem solving, civic-minded individuals. We want folks that have multi-language skills. And so for us, our big challenge is a continual selling of this, if you will, to the community, because it is a qualitative measure and we are working through surveys and other measures. We know it's working. We can feel it in the schools. We feel the culture. We can see the outcomes. We know that I think everybody gets an education and teachers get an education. We all do, to build relationships with students and support students. But when you ramp it up so far and the only thing that matters are quantitative measures on the accountability side, I think we lost as a nation that connection to children or to have permission. And for us, what I want to maintain, and I have a lot more room to run now because we actually are meeting our accountability objectives better than any other urban district in Texas. So we have a lot of room to run. But if we weren't doing that, I don't think that I would necessarily have that runway to keep doing the work. So we need to figure out how we're going to measure this in a way that satisfies a large part of our community that wants quantitative measures for the work that we're doing. But I can assure you the skills that we're helping kids build, I call this a learning behind the learning. So my mandate to our instructors is I want you to go from 80% lecturing to 20% lecturing. And we're going to coach you and figure out how to get that done. And just by turning the page on that, the skills that we're going to help kids build, especially our kids of color, kids of poverty, are skills that they might not have built anywhere else because they don't have those advocates in their neighborhoods. So we're going to take the mantle and do it in our schools. And that right there, you talk from a C student that was able to get a few things done in life, those skills and helping kids develop those skills, I hate to say it, are going to be as important as whatever academic success we can bring to them.
Right. Thanks, Juan. Sujata, any closing thoughts on bringing new models to scale?
I think that people need to have methods so that they can understand what it is that they're trying to build, and then looked for models that are, say, 80% of the way there that they can adapt and adopt, versus like, let's put in a new program, let's try one different kind of professional development, because schools are systems. And a model lets you acknowledge, like, okay, these are the HR systems that need to change. These are the technology systems that need to change. So how might we use a model method to jumpstart when communities arrive at their why and what they're trying to get to?
No, I appreciate that. I wrote a 2018 book called Better Together, which said, the stuff's super hard, do it together, work with like-minded communities, using models to bring excellence and equity to scale. Carlos, take us out with some closing thoughts on what's next.
Great book, by the way, Better Together with my sister Lydia Dobbins. So just shout out there.
Yeah.
I think I'll state that in terms of how do we get there in an equitable way, equitably shared at its core just has to mean that we all rise together. We, especially those of us with the most privilege in this country, need to appreciate and respect that having people with a wide range of roles, talents, gifts in society are important, are good people, and deserve to live a good life. And we rely on each other. And I know for each of us, we're running systems, leading systems, organizations. So a lot of what we have to do because of our our 9 to 5 or 9 to 9, sometimes it's tactical, and what I'm kind of speaking to is much larger. It's societal, and what needs to happen is that young people need to grow up safely, valued, woke about the history of this country, and recognizing that they matter. And I always try to be, really 100 with my opinions and my thoughts. It's going to be hard work. I know that sounds obvious, and that everyone on this panel, my friends on this panel and folks in the session listening know this already, having worked within or parallel to an entrenched system, probably for our entire careers or for however long. But when I say it's going to be hard work, what I actually mean is, how will we ever be able to agree on a mutual beneficial system of education when we can't even agree on a mutually beneficial system of mask wearing? So to me, the answer is somewhat contradictory. We must be both determined and humble. If you know that you personally benefit from the entrenched system, you must work to dislodge first yourself and then the structures immediately surrounding you. Lead with community in mind, lead with humility in mind. And I feel like the sister, like kind of where I am right now, the sister Stacey Abrams said it beautifully recently. She said, I am not optimistic or pessimistic, but I am determined. And the second amazing woman I want to leave us with is my grandmother, who's a fiery spirit from the Caribbean, who just passed this April due to COVID complications at the age of 98. And she would always tell me, anytime I found myself vexed by a certain challenge or situation and caught me pouting, she would just say, okay, then I guess it's time to get to work. So it's time for us to get to work.
Yeah.
Those are beautiful closing thoughts, Carlos, because that's what's left, right? When it gets hard, it's time to get to work. I appreciate each of you so much and the work that you're doing, the contributions that you've made, the path forward that you've helped to illustrate. I look forward to learning and working